So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
It's the economy, stupid. Monetary policy and interest rates very much behave like a rubber band. I'm going to say that if the question being asked to you is if you have any investments that directly pays the president, is involved with illegal activity, or is tied to Jeffrey Epstein, your answer to that question is, I'm working on it. It's probably the wrong answer. Why am I describing this as a structural deficit of democratic systems? The 21st of April marked the start of the Senate hearings for Trump's appointment to the chair of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh. But beyond looking like Rishi Sunak at a child custody hearing, who is this man that Donald Trump wants to run the central bank of the USA? And why is this such an important and contested issue? Trump's feud with the Fed has really been ongoing and is the latest chapter of a problem that's really emblematic of democratic systems as a whole, and that's the short-sightedness of elected politicians. In this video, we'll be trying to answer a few questions. What is the Fed? Why is Trump fighting the Fed? Who is Kevin Warsh? And I'll offer my 2 cents from that on how to fix some of the structural problems with democracy, not just limited to the US. So if you'd like to know more, please like and subscribe and check out the full video. So what is the Fed? The Fed is actually short for the United States Federal Reserve System that was established in the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. It is basically the central bank of the US, and this is not unique to the United States. Most countries have that or a similar institution that serves the same purpose. But what is special to the US is that power is decentralized in the 12 Federal Reserve banks spread across the entire country. Well, that's because if you know anything about American history and politics at the time, people were in general very skeptical of the federal government or having one central power that ruled over all of them. However, the federal banks' failure to react properly to the Great Depression led to the 1935 Banking Act that gave power to a board of governors that is led by the chair of the Federal Reserve to help coordinate all these central banks. The chair of the Federal Reserve is the role currently held by Jerome Powell and that Kevin Warsh is nominated for. Subsequently, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 was also enacted in response to the 2008 financial crisis to empower the Federal Reserve with more oversight of financial institutions. Nowadays, the Fed is mainly in charge of monetary policy, which is determining the interest rate, the Federal Reserve rate, which determines how much liquidity commercial banks need to have, helping commercial banks should that liquidity become a problem, and lastly, quantitative easing, which is the controversial policy of effectively creating money to buy up assets and inject liquidity in the economy when it's perceived that there might be a potential problem, which is why they're memed for being a money printer. These are all done to achieve the objectives of maintaining the inflation rate and also to lower unemployment rate. In short, the Fed basically controls money flow in the US economy. But given how important the US economy is and the significance of the US dollar, the impacts of this could be very far-reaching.
So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, he's not a smart guy. He's worried about inflation. I said, that's right. If there's inflation in 6 months or 9 months, you lower the rates. So
Well, but that doesn't quite explain why is this such a big deal? Why is Donald Trump so insistent on fighting the Fed, which, bear in mind, Jerome Powell was appointed by Donald Trump himself to be the chair of the Federal Reserve. Well, there's a reason why the chair of the Federal Reserve is constantly ranked as one of the most influential people in the entire world. It's important to note that the chair does not solely determine the policy on the things we mentioned above. What he does is he runs and coordinates the board of governors who collectively determine the policy on the economy. That being said, he does have significant influence over the board. And also all the media attention is on this one person. The word of the chair of the Fed, how bullish he is on the economy and the markets, has the potential to impact markets across the entire world. Now, what Donald Trump has been looking for is for Jerome Powell and the Fed to lower interest rates. Why? Because lowering interest rates means that people save less money and also borrow more money. In other words, there's more money flowing around in the economy, and that helps stimulate the economy. Going back to the famous phrase, it's the economy, stupid. From a political point of view, having the economic numbers look good means it's very promising for his politics and his reputation as being a strong president for the economy. That being said, Jerome Powell has refused to do so because of the inflation rate. Now, as you can imagine, if you lower interest rates and more money flows around the economy, but nothing important changes about the supply in the economy, prices will go up because people have more access to money and can pay more for certain things. However, the inflation rate is currently already at 3.26%, which is quite a bit higher than the target inflation rate of the Fed at 2%. Now, I personally fully agree that inflation rate should be one of the primary concerns for the Federal Reserve. And that is because the inflation rate determines how much American citizens or citizens in general can afford in the economy. If the inflation rate goes too high, people's quality of life are not protected. There are also further structural problems to over-abusing of interest rates as an economic leverage. Firstly, there's a potential to lose control. Because monetary policy and interest rates very much behave like a rubber band to economists. If you try to pull too hard, it snaps, but also when it's already too low and you try to push it, it doesn't really work. In other words, when interest rates are already low enough and you try to further decrease interest rates, it might work for a short period of time. But structurally speaking, in the long term, that means that you kind of lose a certain leverage and ability to control the economy or help stimulate the economy when a real economic crisis happens. Because interest rates are already so low that if you further cut it, it does not really affect behavior in the economy. Furthermore, it also increases the structural risk within the US economy. Because by lowering interest rates, you're encouraging people to borrow money. And for asking people to borrow more money means that they're increasing their leverage. And if the 2008 financial crisis has taught us anything, too much leverage means that if one single thing fails, the entire economy topples.
Zero. Triple B's. Zero. And then that happens.
Now, this is not to say that there are no existing problems with the Fed, right? There have been lots of scandals and controversies surrounding current officials. And furthermore, Jerome Powell himself was criticized for using too much of quantitative easing in response to the COVID pandemic. That being said, in general, it's important to make sure that the Fed is insulated and protected from political pressures, or else it might make decisions that, in the long term, structurally damage the American economy. Now that we've established what the Fed is all about, let's look at Kevin Warsh, the person Donald Trump is nominating to run the Federal Reserve. Now firstly, he has previously served on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. He himself comes from a background of being a very experienced Wall Street guy, and his past track record suggests that he's quite hawkish on the economy. In other words, he believes in minimal interference, and the primary concern being to keep inflation rate low. That being said, he has also previously said on multiple occasions before the 2008 financial crisis that he did not believe there was a liquidity problem in the US. And I'll give him that, most people back then didn't see any problem with the economy. It'd be kind of like over harsh to expect that he was able to spot these problems when all the other experts didn't, right? But recently, in the Senate hearing that we previously mentioned, Senator Elizabeth Warren asked him this question.
Invest in any companies affiliated with President Trump or his family, companies that have facilitated money laundering, Chinese-controlled companies, or financing vehicles established by Jeffrey Epstein.
Now, what she's basically asking is that there's $100 million of investments under his name that he refused to reveal to the Senate what they're all about. This was his response.
Senator, I have worked tirelessly with the ethics officials at the office.
Now, I'm going to say that if the question being asked to you is if you have any investments that directly pays the president, is involved with illegal activity, or is tied to Jeffrey Epstein, your answer to that question is, I'm working on it. It's probably the wrong answer. And while his past track record suggests that he believes in not overly cutting the interest rates, he has now very much been in line with Donald Trump's policy in saying that he needs to cut interest rates to help boost the economy. Now, you might say that, anyone that Donald Trump would potentially even nominate to the role to begin with will at least on the surface have to agree with his policies, or else that person will never even be in the position to be nominated or considered before the Senate. So him saying that is not necessarily a problem. He might just be trying to get the job. But what I'm going to say is, if the structural integrity of the US economy relies on the whims of someone who is very comfortable with lying, who is very comfortable with being deceitful, that doesn't seem to be a very surefire bet. So you might be wondering, why am I describing this as a structural deficit of democratic systems, not just limited to the US, right? You might argue that elected governments and elected presidents should have the right to influence economic policy. Now, firstly, governments already have the ability and have the area where they can do that, and that's called the fiscal policy, which is related to government spending and includes elements such as taxes and subsidies. They can use that to stimulate the economy in ways that they want to, and that should be independent from the monetary policy. And secondly, I think the best example that illustrates my point is really with infrastructure in the US. The American Society for Civil Engineers rated the US infrastructure level a grade C in the year of 2025, which is an improvement from previous years, but I think we can all agree that it's probably not a satisfactory grade just yet. The World Population Review ranks the US 11th in infrastructure worldwide, which isn't terrible, but given that the US is literally the richest country in the entire world, it also probably shouldn't be the case. There's a reason why certain elements are kind of independent or isolated from the elected government and the elected officials' whims. And the reason for that, in part, is because democracy and elected politicians fundamentally are very short-sighted. This is more severe in the US due to the election cycles. The US runs midterm elections, which basically happens once every 2 years. And although not all politicians are elected or re-elected during the midterm elections, it does mean that you have to get involved in fundraising and party campaigning, which means whenever an official is elected to government or into the position, they're already kind of starting to think about the next election cycle or what they have to do or what results they have to produce for the next election in order to get themselves re-elected or help the party. That means that they are fundamentally prone to being short-sighted. So the reason why infrastructure is falling behind the US, because infrastructure is in part one of those things where if you invest in it now and if you enact policies to kind of help and build infrastructure right now, you're taking a bunch of money away from the economy, but also not necessarily seeing the results of that immediately. Oftentimes, if you invest in infrastructure, it means that you're reallocating the budget from other positions that can kind of directly produce immediate results. But the results of the infrastructure can only probably be seen kind of 10 years down the line. And by then, a lot of the elected government officials are probably not around anymore, and someone else from the next election will stand to reap the benefits of work that you have done right now. So for politicians, it's not very productive for their kind of survival within the political climate to invest in long-term policy. And that is in part what you're seeing right now with the interest rates and why Donald Trump is so actively trying to influence the Federal Reserve. That is also why certain elements of the government are actually not elected, even under democratic systems, right? The civil service is independent. And we do see signs of like attacking the civil service that are also present in other democracies, such as the UK, famously done by the Conservative Party and Jacob Rees-Mogg. The reason for that is because it's easy to kind of blame the anonymous government officials that you don't really identify or don't elect with and say that it's their fault, their problem for not executing a policy properly, but not kind of your fault for determining the direction of the policy to begin with. Now, here on this channel, I like to think about things a little bit more positively, right? I've kind of sown a lot of doubt and fear over what Donald Trump is doing with the Federal Reserve, but I think there is a takeaway from this. By referencing how infrastructure is being operated in the US, I would argue that elements such as that are probably better off being done and executed by professionals, like industry experts who actually know kind of what they're doing. And that includes the Federal Reserve. They should be the people who properly understand policy in that area and think about the long-term plan for the country. And I would argue kind of maintaining low inflation and low unemployment rate is not something that is fundamentally political, right? There's no problem with that being something that is isolated from political elections or kind of party lines. And the same thing applies to infrastructure. If infrastructure is needed, it needs to be built. And it shouldn't be an issue of whether or not the Republicans or the Democrats want to build a certain piece of infrastructure. And there's actually been an update to this story since I began recording this video. And that is the Department of Justice under Donald Trump just announced that they're dropping the criminal probe into current Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. This is in part because Republican Senator Thom Tillis insisted that this probe to be dropped before they will move on to confirm Warsh. These are signs of blatant political influence into institutions that I personally would argue and believe should be considered to be independent and removed from the political ecosystem. That is because societies as a whole require long-term planning, and democracies don't do a very good job at doing that. That also means that I think we should take the time and use this as an opportunity to think of what other elements need to be restructured and governed into the civil service Federal Reserve branch of being operated by industry professionals who at least know what they're doing. Because just because politicians are good at fundraising and good at rallying people, or even good at setting up the big direction for where policy is going, doesn't mean they know how to execute these things well. Especially since this new development, I don't expect that the nomination of Kevin Warsh will realistically be blocked by the Senate. And also, to be perfectly fair, as I've previously mentioned, there is an argument to be made that potentially Warsh can still be capable of doing the right thing when he's in that position. However, I do think it's quite worrying that we're, again, relying on how trustworthy or how much we can hope and pray that these politicians will eventually reach the right conclusion, despite going through a very dubious process by getting into that position to begin with. I will also say that I don't think this is necessarily a problem for politicians to use kind of almost mafia tactics of threatening and deterrence to get things done. But blatant influence into institutions that should probably remain independent in order to keep the system afloat or the structure intact should not be allowed. So that is the bigger picture around the nomination of the Federal Reserve Chair and why this is such a kind of contested, a hot topic issue. I think it's probably not realistic for the current Senate to block the nomination of Kevin Warsh, especially given the new development that the charges are being dropped against Jerome Powell. Hopefully, kind of by getting a sense of what this actually means in the wider democratic system, it helps us pay attention to some of these issues and kind of think about systems in the future. If we think of how we're going to design these institutions and design structures that can protect the society's long-term interests and benefits, there are certain elements where we might actually have to remove the fold and the short-sightedness that is inherent to democracy from the process. But let me know what you think. Are there other areas of policy that might kind of benefit from being removed or detached from elected politicians? Or is that fundamentally an issue of being undemocratic?
If you have made it this far, firstly, thank you so much for watching the video. It also probably means that you're at least okay with the content you're seeing here. So please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot. And for the meantime, please check out this video for more of the similar good stuff.